Hello, fair viewers. I'm in the middle of research for another one of my world building videos, but to tide you over today, I thought it'd be fun to take a little break and talk about something that's on a lot of people's minds lately, The Last of Us. Because I love the video game and want to talk about this adaptation, and also because something, notice me algorithm senpai, something. Fun fact, The Last of Us was filmed exclusively in my home province of Alberta, and just like the dystopian world of the show, real-life Alberta's got more than our share of trucks, gun nuts, underfunded hospitals, rebels, and infection too. Yay! I've mentioned the video game on this channel before, but with the release of the HBO show, some of the same questions gamers asked themselves after completing the game for the first time years ago are being hotly debated again. Did Joel make the right choice? Who disregarded Ellie's consent more, Joel or Marlene? And does that even matter? So I wanted to dig into the writing craft for The Last of Us and see what answers we might find there. Before I get into it, it is important to point out that The Last of Us is often intentionally ambiguous about what moral judgments gamers or viewers are supposed to make about its main characters. Everyone in this show is a little morally gray. So if you have different opinions than mine, that doesn't necessarily mean either you or I misread cues. It means that the endless debating fans have done over these questions has kept The Last of Us relevant for years, and it's in the writer's best interest to zip their lips about what they wanted you to take from the story. It keeps the buzz going. That said, I do think a little character and writing craft analysis can give us a clearer picture of what the story might have been trying to say. And, oh yeah, spoiler warning for the entirety of Season 1 of the TV show and the first game. One of the central points you'll see debated by fans of this story regards Ellie's choice, whether or not she would want to die for the Firefly's cause.
But it isn't for you to decide.
Or you. So what would she decide, huh?
Who was worse for their disregard of Ellie's consent? Marlene, who didn't bother getting Ellie's consent in the first place, or Joel, who likely knew what Ellie wanted but ignored her wish anyway in order to save her life? But I would like to posit this. Ellie's consent is a moot point. Ellie is a child. She's a 14-year-old living in a post-apocalyptic nightmare, but a 14-year-old nonetheless. And there are certain choices adults should be protecting children from making, even in post-apocalyptic nightmares. Whether the kid wants 20-year-old ravioli for supper or 20-year-old Irish stew, sure, let them decide that. I mean, both are probably going to give her indigestion, but fed is best. Whether or not they, under the immense pressure of being told millions will continue to die if they don't consent, do they want to die on the off chance that the nice lady with the guns and the pipe bombs and the militia is not only genuine in her desire to cure the cordyceps infection, but also capable of seeing it through? That's not really a scenario anyone can fairly consent to, but especially not a child who has already grown up being manipulated and fed propaganda by adults. Heck, in this dystopian hellscape, even Fedra waits until kids in their care are 17 before giving them their own gun and uniform and expecting them to make life or death choices. So, chalk one up for Fedra, I guess. Yikes. So the question isn't really whether Joel or Marlene disrespected Ellie's choice more, but rather, at what point is the sacrifice of a child justified? And your answer to this will entirely depend on what your values and background are. But what does the story of The Last of Us have to say for itself? Both the video game and the HBO adaptation explore the concept of survival, of just how far we'll go to survive and what atrocities we'll excuse in the name of it.
We are survivors.
This is our chance!
It is over, Tess!
In the game, you'll often hear characters remark how they did what they had to in order to survive, how they didn't have a choice but to do the violent, terrible things that they did in order to live to see another day.
Considering you and your friend killed how many men?
They didn't give us a choice.
And you think we have a choice? Is that it?
Everyone from Joel, and eventually Ellie, to Bill, to Fedra, to the Fireflies, They all use the threat of the infected to justify taking almost any kind of immoral action. In the HBO adaptation, this is taken even a step further in a few cases. Henry and Sam are given a new backstory from the game, one in which Henry ensures the death of a good man in order to prolong his brother's survival.
I am the bad guy because I did a bad guy thing.
In episode 8, David gives a speech about seeing the light through cordyceps, and he uses it to justify not only his murders and cannibalism, but even what we later learn is an interest in, younger women.
It loves.
Throughout both versions of the story, we are being asked to engage with the moral choices of these characters and to draw our own lines in the sand. How far would we go? How much would we justify? When is killing a child cold, heartless murder? And when might it be a necessary evil? But the story doesn't only ask us how far we would or should go to survive. It also asks us, what's the point of surviving? In the video game, Bill, who is still alive and kicking in this version of the story, is no longer living happily with Frank. When Joel and Ellie arrive, they learn Bill and Frank have had a bit of a spat, and Frank has gone off to live somewhere else in the town. Bill, perhaps a little too enthusiastically, assures Joel that he's better off without Frank, that having someone you care about is a sure way to get you killed.
Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about. A partner. Somebody I had to look after. And in this world, that sort of shit's good for one thing. Getting you killed. So you know what I did? I wisened the fuck up. And I realized it's gotta be just me.
Bill, at least verbally, ranks his survival above human connection, which, just a theory, may have had something to do with his falling out with Frank. And Bill is surviving, but from what we can tell, he spends his days doing little but checking and resetting his traps, alone, untrusting, and very, very bitter. When we later discover that Frank took his own life after being bitten by one of the infected, Bill is not as unaffected as he pretends to be.
He's got bites. Here. And
I reckon he didn't want to turn, so
yeah, I guess not.
For all that Bill says it's safer to be alone, it was going off alone that ended in Frank's death. If you're only familiar with the television show, this might be a surprising change to you, considering the loving relationship Bill and Frank had in that version. The TV show instead leans into the beauty of Bill and Frank's relationship in the midst of hardship. They're there for each other. They grow old together. They come together to make their home and lives not only safer, but more satisfying, more filled with love, happiness, hobbies, and a sense of fulfillment. And when it is time for their end, they don't have to justify committing terrible deeds to gain them one more day. They're satisfied with the joy they made for themselves, together, with love. Then we have Henry and Sam. While their backstories are also different from game to show, in both versions of the story, Henry is fiercely protective of Sam, not just of his physical well-being, but also his emotional well-being. He loves his little brother dearly, and when Sam is gone, Henry loses his will to live too. To him, there's no point in surviving without Sam. When Joel gets Ellie to Jackson and reunites with Tommy, he expects to hand responsibility for Ellie over to his brother, in part because Tommy was a Firefly with a bit of a hero complex. In other words, this journey with Ellie is exactly the task Tommy should throw himself into. But surprisingly, Tommy refuses, stating,
"My cause is my family now."
And he's not willing to risk that for a chance to increase humanity's odds of survival. In the video game, Tommy only agrees to take Joel's place after he realizes just how attached to Ellie Joel has become.
We gotta run, and so we dove over these tables, and this huge guy blasted with a shotgun.
Slow down. Listen, hey, are you hurt?
No.
God damn it.
When he realizes that should something happen to Ellie while in Joel's care, Joel might not recover from the loss of a beloved daughter a second time. And Tommy, in turn, would lose Joel. Saving mankind isn't worth the risk to Tommy, but saving Joel is. We also have Ellie and Riley getting bitten, but fighting for one more day. Not for the sake of surviving, but for the sake of spending what time they have together. And of course, we also have Joel's entire character arc, where he goes from being a hardened survivor who fears opening himself up to love, to becoming a father figure who would give his life up in a heartbeat to save Ellie. In The Last of Us, so many characters are concerned with surviving to the point that they will turn against friends, murder strangers, and even consume human flesh. In short, in order to save humanity, they destroy it. But the story repeatedly tells us that survival doesn't matter without connection, love, family, and community. The infected in The Last of Us are creepy, ruthless, and pervasive. They're not a lot of fun to have around, but they're also not the real threat. The infected are a threat, and certainly a nasty one, but, and this will come as no surprise to most people who've lived through the past 3 years, it isn't so much that the cordyceps infection caused all of the world's problems directly, but rather that its existence exposed underlying problems society already had. For a story about a zombie apocalypse, The Last of Us takes time and care to show that the real dangers in the world are the uninfected people who fight over territory, resources, or ideology. The infected are there. They're a risk, but they're a manageable one, if not for the problems the uninfected people create for each other. In the TV series, Bill and Frank don't really need to worry about the infected. They've got their traps set up and their fence, and as long as they keep everything in repair, they're well protected from cordyceps. But as Joel reminds Bill, raiders are still a threat. Similarly, in the video game, Bill sets traps around his hideouts and safe houses, but otherwise, he actually allows infected to roam through his town. Why? Because the infected keep the uninfected out. Bill uses the infected to keep himself safe from the uninfected. And he even has this line.
You picked a hell of a place to hole up, didn't you?
You know, as bad as those things are, at least they're predictable. The normal people that scare me. You of all people should understand that.
Next, when Ellie and Joel meet Henry and Sam, it's uninfected humans who are the biggest threat to their lives, and in both versions of the story, they risk the infected to get away from the uninfected. In the TV series version of the story, the people in Kansas City had already dealt with the cordyceps infection, but that hardly ended the deaths or violence, and Kathleen is more interested in killing Henry than she is in protecting her and her people from the infected. Ironically, the infected actually end up saving our heroes from Kathleen and her crew. Well, they end up saving some of our heroes anyway. Then in Jackson, Tommy and Maria are living in what, by this world's standards, is a virtual utopia. They and several other families have joined forces to make a better life for everyone in their group, and while they're very protective of their borders and town, they don't have to resort to killing people unnecessarily to steal food or other resources from them. In fact, in the second game, we learned that they even do trade with other communities. They're doing well for themselves, and the infected are a manageable problem that don't impede on the people of Jackson's capacity for happiness and full lives. And staying on brand, not to get too spoilery for the second game, but what does prove to be the real threat for the people of Jackson is, once again, uninfected people. And then we have David, who for most people seems to be the scariest antagonist in the game, and for good reason. Cannibalism aside, he's a very realistic predator of the sort who exists in our zombie-free world. The infected are less terrifying, less monstrous than him, and he's just an ordinary, uninfected, cannibalistic pedo. There's no doubt that the infected are a problem, but again and again the story shows us that they're not the real problem, which calls into question whether or not Ellie sacrificing her life would actually save the world at all. But there's one more thing I wanted to discuss, because when people argue that Joel was wrong to save Ellie and that he condemned millions to death, they're usually basing this argument on the assumption that If Ellie died, the world would be cured of cordyceps. Essentially, they trust Marlene and the Fireflies. But are we supposed to? I always find it interesting that people seem to put so much faith in Marlene, especially when we've spent an entire game or TV series being shown just how untrustworthy several of the other characters are. Even our main dude, Joel. So why do we trust Marlene has nobler intentions than anyone else? Why do we trust she will use any vaccine to cure cordyceps for all, especially since she never promises to do that? She never tells us her plan for the vaccine. It's just assumed she'll give it away freely. So why do we trust her? That comes down to the writing and the performance of the character. But let's take a look at that writing, because if you're working on a story where you want to make a character gain the reader's trust, there are several things to learn from The Last of Us in how they get us to lower our guard when it comes to Marlene. First, we know that Joel and Tess know Marlene, not just by reputation, but personally. They have a history with her. They speak freely to Marlene, sometimes dismissively, without getting shot in the face for it. While they don't seem especially fond of her, neither do they fear her or think that she's trying to trick them, so neither do we. Another reason we may initially like Marlene is because what little we know about her is that she's fighting against Fedra soldiers. She's depicted as an enemy of people we already don't like. We just recently watched a soldier kill Joel's innocent daughter. In both the video game and show, we get to watch Fedra killing people who've been infected but haven't turned yet, which means we watch them walking around with guns and killing people who look and seem like ordinary people. We also know that Fedra's rationing food for the populace while sometimes eating it up themselves.
Give us our rations. Why wouldn't they give them their food?
Sometimes they ran out. Most times they just held on to it.
That never happened in Boston.
Trust me, it happened all the time.
And maintaining strict totalitarian rules that citizens break at their own peril. The TV show goes even farther, giving us backstory for what happened during the outbreak, how soldiers executed uninfected people en masse simply because dead people can't spread the disease. We already very much don't like Fedra, so if Marlene's against them, she seems pretty good in our books. But more than that, despite being the leader of a militia that's warring against Fedra, Marlene isn't really presented as a threat to us. The first we meet her in the game, though it happens a bit later in the show, she's wounded, and her militia is severely weakened. Fedra's got the upper hand on her, so she's presented as more of an underdog rather than a danger, and we like to root for underdogs. Marlene is also presented as maternal, which automatically disarms us. In both the video game and the television show, she is associated with Ellie's mother. In Ellie and Marlene's first scene together in the game, Marlene acts like a protective parent toward Ellie. In their first scene together in the show, Ellie outright asks if Marlene is her mother, which seems silly, but it immediately makes that association in our minds as well. In the TV show, Riley talks about the Fireflies as though they're her family, reinforcing the idea of Marlene as a mother figure. Marlene is motherly. She cares about Ellie. So surely she wouldn't sacrifice Ellie's life unless she absolutely had to. And she would make dang sure to honor Ellie's sacrifice by saving the world, wouldn't she? We also trust Marlene because Ellie wholeheartedly does, because we like Ellie and because we want what Ellie wants. We so badly want a cure that could have saved Tess, Frank, Sam, and Riley that we overlook that Marlene, for all her leading a rebellion, never promised to save anyone. All of this disarms us in regard to how we view Marlene, but if you're paying close attention to the story, there are also a lot of subtle details that are meant to make you question her. In the TV show, Marlene is the one who ordered the scientists to chain and study Ellie. While some viewers may already suspect that Ellie has been infected, thus potentially justifying the actions of these people, we don't know that for sure at this point. She's just a kid chained to a wall, and Marlene has made no appearance before this to make sure Ellie is okay, to soothe her fears and calm her, or to explain to her what's going on. Which calls into question how motherly Marlene really is. Another thing that calls Marlene's maternal nature into question is we realize that Marlene, despite taking responsibility for Ellie as a baby, had no involvement in Ellie's upbringing, leaving her to be raised by Fedra, her supposed enemy. Yet another thing that asks us to question Marlene's maternal qualities is Riley, particularly in the TV show. Ellie and Riley banter back and forth about which of them is the one falling for propaganda and being manipulated. This pointed comparison may make us ask whether the Fireflies are even that different from Fedra. And Riley may say that the Fireflies are like her family, yet Marlene is clearly using Riley. She has her making bombs, stationed alone in a mall that they haven't sufficiently made sure was safe for her and clear of infected. And if Riley's account of how Marlene recruited her is even remotely true, suddenly approaching a not-quite 17-year-old the moment Riley was alone and vulnerable in the dark, which, suggests Marlene was watching Riley and waiting for the right moment to strike, that's not only not very motherly, that's downright predatory. Riley is being used for Marlene's own agenda against Fedra, and so is Ellie. And there's an interesting parallel happening in this episode, because just as Marlene is portrayed as a mother figure, this Fedra man is portrayed as a father figure, drawing further connections between the Fireflies and Fedra. It's just a short scene, but the first thing we learn about this guy from the photograph on his desk is that he's a family man and father. Rather than disciplining Ellie in a corporal way, he has a fatherly chat with her in which he gently chides her and convinces her to choose a better path for herself. These parallels should make us wonder if Marlene or the Fireflies are all that different from Fedra. In the video game, and done a little bit differently in the show, but also there, we see Joel and Tess narrowly miss being blown up by a bomb planted by the Fireflies. The game uses this to teach players how to recover health, so we know that Joel was hurt, if not mortally wounded. Riley can promise that the Fireflies would never kill civilians all she likes, but these incidents in the TV show and the game tell us that that's exactly what the Fireflies are doing. But the story doesn't just give us reason to question Marlene's motivations or morality, but also the capability of the Fireflies. Her people are presented as failing. Just as I mentioned that presenting Marlene and the Fireflies as the underdogs makes us trust her, it should also maybe make us question her. Not only have her people been gunned down by Fedra, leaving Marlene to require Joel's help in smuggling Ellie out of Boston in the first place, but the people they're supposed to meet at the Capitol building have also all been killed. When Joel and Ellie finally make it to the Firefly lab in Colorado, they find it empty. In the video game, we learn that the Fireflies abandoned that lab after one of their scientists fumbled his experiments and was bitten by an infected monkey.
Sure glad we didn't mess with them monkeys.
Not to mention that Joel, one man acting alone, is able to successfully fight his way through several Fireflies in order to save Ellie. In the second game, we learn that Joel's actions all but dissolved the Fireflies as a militia. The Fireflies are kind of incompetent when you think about it. Or at the very least, they've already bitten off more than they can chew. If Marlene can barely keep her own people alive, if one man can completely overturn her militia's plans, if she and her people can't even protect one girl most people don't know is immune, how can we trust that the Fireflies are in a position to properly make and distribute a vaccine to the entire world? Even if Marlene intended to distribute the vaccine freely, what would stop Fedra or other groups from finishing off the Fireflies and using the vaccine for themselves? As one final note, again, not to get too spoilery, but in The Last of Us Part 2, we meet a few of the Fireflies who avoided or survived Joel's rampage to save Ellie. And we learn that many of these Fireflies are every bit as hypocritical, self-motivated, and vindictive as anyone else in the story. And when this story also contains murderous bandits and cannibals, that's not exactly giving the Fireflies a glowing review. I give them 2 stars for effort. If you ask me, and this is my own personal speculation, I sincerely doubt the Fireflies had any intentions of giving the vaccine away freely, and I find it interesting that gamers or viewers would believe that Marlene, given all her behavior and at times cold cruelty, would use the vaccine to save the world out of the kindness of her heart, rather than to use it as a tool to further the cause that she has already spent years of her life pursuing, that she has already poured so much blood, sweat, and tears into. Her war against Fedra. I think it far more likely Marlene would have inoculated the Fireflies than used the infected as biological warfare, releasing them into the QZs to weaken Fedra, regardless of the cost to civilians. Or perhaps they would have held the vaccine hostage, demanding the QZs meet the Fireflies' demands before receiving any vaccine, regardless of whether or not those demands were in the best interest of the people. But once word of the vaccine got out, not only would Fedra be motivated to seek to destroy the Fireflies even more than ever and to take the vaccine for themselves, but so would the Kathleens of the world. No, I don't think Ellie's death would have saved anyone. I think it would have meant war, worse than the world already knew. I think it would have meant the death of thousands, maybe millions, and perhaps the vaccine wouldn't have even survived it at all in the end. And if that's true, rather than condemning others to die by saving Ellie, Joel just may have saved thousands of others, even if he only sought to save himself. But that's just my theory. What's yours? The Last of Us questions us about what it means to survive and what's worth being saved. It shows us that sometimes our worst nightmare isn't the real danger, but merely a reflection of the real danger in us. It also shows us that when adults stop making excuses for their hypocrisy and violence, when they come together to build a community that protects and uplifts all, they are fully capable of solving their own problems without having to sacrifice 14-year-old girls. They are perfectly capable of saving themselves. Most just don't want to. They, like many of us, want an easy way out. Even if the infected disappeared overnight, the world in The Last of Us would still be rife with problems that Ellie's death couldn't possibly fix. And if the adults aren't willing to do the work to fix those problems, they're not going away with a vaccine either. So I wanted to amend the question I asked earlier in this video. Instead of, at what point is the sacrifice of a child justified, the question should be instead, can we justify the sacrifice of a child simply because adults refuse to work together to solve their own problems? But that's it for this video. What are your takes on The Last of Us? Did you play the game? Did you enjoy the show? I had a good time with the show. If I'm being nitpicky, there were some things I didn't like, such as Joel having PTSD flashbacks when a soldier pointed his gun at Ellie, only for Joel to later point his own gun at Ellie multiple times. But there were also some additions to the story I adored, namely this woman. This woman. Utter perfection, no notes. And as a born and raised Albertan, I loved getting to see my homeland as the backdrop for this beautifully dark and bittersweet story. Many of the film locations are places I know well and love, and there's something especially unsettling about seeing your childhood falling apart, crawling with infected, or overrun with cannibals. But man,
Can't deny that view.